All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lindsay Elliott, and I'm the Marketing and Communications Manager at Sysgrip. And I'd like to welcome you today to our Flash webinar. So thank you for joining us on our discussion. This webinar is the first in a two-part series titled The Clinical Trial Challenge, Boosting Clinical Trial Appeal in Patient Communities. And I'd like to introduce our moderator and our panelists today. We have Pam Cusick, Senior Vice President from Rare Patient Voice, and Grace Charrier, who is the host of Cancer Convos with Grace and a cancer advocate. So Rare Patient Voice is leading this two-part series, and they provide patients and family caregivers with opportunities to participate in all types of research, including market research, health economic outcomes, and real-world evidence, user experience, human factor studies, and clinical trials. RPV has over 100,000 patients and caregivers across more than 750 diseases, both rare and non-rare, across the country and the world. And with that, I will turn it over to Pam and Grace to get us started.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Lindsay. So in September, Rare Patient Voice conducted a survey with about almost 2,000 respondents, patients and caregivers across the United States. We focused on clinical trial preferences. So there were a lot of really interesting things that came up, and I'm going to talk about several topics today, and my colleague Wes is going to talk about a few more in his flash webinar in December. So the two areas that came up as very important were compensation and support, and also trial location. So if we go to the next slide, please. So one of the things that we found was that patients, over 95%, really wanted or were interested in being compensated for participating in trials. And at Rare Patient Voice, we pay patients at the rate of $100 an hour for market research, so focus groups and interviews and surveys and things like that. But they don't get compensated for clinical trials. And this is something that clearly a lot of them are interested in. And so, Grace, I'm wondering what you hear from your community.
Thank you ever so much for having me here. Really honored. Yes, my community, is actually believes in compensation, because it's a means of encouraging participation. I know of several patients that were involved in clinical trials, were relieved to know that compensation was on the table. And this happened to be the added impetus for them to go ahead with the clinical trials, research costs and what should I say, for taking part in the trial also are usually not covered by health insurance, and patients that have already been affected by financial toxicity, would surely welcome it and do welcome it. So for me, compensation is actually reward for the risk involved in participation.
That's very important. The there can be a risk, so that's a very important topic as well. So another thing that emerged was that patients would like a point of contact to help them to arrange travel. And as you know, their clinical trials could be in your local city, but they could also be across the country. They could be outside of the country, and there are lots of complexities, involved with the logistics. So airfare or flights and hotels and taxis, and figuring out how to get from point A to point B can be hard at the easiest of times. But then, if you're participating in a trial, you might have additional complications. So having an organization that can help you with that seemed to be, very important to a lot of the patients in our survey. Is that something that your community has discussed at all, Grace?
Oh, yes, several times, because when entering, anybody knows this, when entering a clinical trial, the time required to arrange, travel to and from the study site and all that is like, horrendous. Already the patient is dealing with so much. And so this can be considered a barrier to participation if this is not kept on the table. And, the patient's convenience and well-being should be, strictly priority, and this having a point of contact should be, the very essence of the whole clinical trial itself. They'll have less to worry about. And like you rightly said, going from one state to another is can be quite overwhelming, not to talk about if there's a clinical trial in another country, for example. You have to get visa, you have to get your flight tickets, you have to have people who are actually there on, in that country to be able to, help, make your experience comfortable. So yes, this having a point of contact is actually very crucial at a time like this.
No, I agree. So the next thing, similar to this one, the next slide, please. Next thing that came up was most of the patients also mentioned that they'd like to be reimbursed for other costs. So not just their travel, but the meals and the, parking and things like that come up. I don't know, how often, people have been into the hospital recently, but parking at a hospital is very expensive. Eating at a hospital is expensive. And if you have to spend multiple days, it can be, quite a big out-of-pocket expense. So, having that as another benefit to participating seemed also to be very important to the patients that we surveyed. And is that something that that has come up in your community at all, Grace?
Yes, indeed. One thing, if you would permit me, is to actually, because a lot of them get quite confused between compensation and reimbursement. When you're dealing with something like this, you already have your health challenges and you're talking about money. There's it's like blurred lines, so to speak. So just for many of them who I'm sure will be watching this webinar, is to actually explain what the reimbursement part is, because many of them may not know, and I'm sure others. And that is to actually explain that reimbursement is actually the money that is given to the patient to offset, their expenses, like parking, like food, like, tickets and all that. And back to the question, I know of many of them who have been reimbursed, but I've heard of a couple who have said, it was not actually on the table. Yes, and they felt very bad about it. There's an example where participants were reimbursed to a set amount, and also that they were very, very uncomfortable in the sense that at the beginning, these are things that should have been explained to them, to kind of let them know that, okay, these are things we're going to take care of. These are things that, we can reimburse you for and all of that. But a couple of them have also said that those expenses, such as like for, childcare costs, a lot of them are grandparents, right? And they had to, the parents and, their children are not around. And so they are, caregivers for these young ones. They have to lug them around to these sites, so the researchers have to take care of things like that, taking care of childcare, what should I say, internet and all that, which are on the site. So these are things that are now minimized. They don't pay as much as if they had to, because they're actually on site, So I just permit me to say that prior to participation, these things have to be, in the informed consent, thing has to be brought up so that they know, because many of them do not know.
Right.
They're trying to save their lives. They're trying to go in for these things. And then, the fine print is usually left out. So, yes.
Right, that's hard. Well, so maybe that also aligns with the prior slide where we were talking about having someone to coordinate that. Because if you had someone who was able to explain all that to you and help you with those logistics and figuring out what would be paid for and what wouldn't be upfront. So you didn't have to worry about it. That might also make it a little bit more appealing.
Absolutely. Yes.
Let's go to the next topic, which was location. So 95% of our patients said that decentralized trials would be moderately to extremely appealing. Certainly there's an ease to being at your own home in some ways. And can you go to the next slide, please, Lindsay? And here were some of the reasons in the survey that came up: the comfort and convenience, the not having to coordinate care for your your children and your pets, and even being exposed to if you have a particular condition that might put you at higher risk, that they didn't necessarily want to be in a trial that was in a hospital or off-site. Is this, does this decentralized versus on-site come up at all in your community?
Yes, it does. But, as seen on the slides, we can see that most patients really appreciate participating remotely. It provides that convenience, as you say, but I must also mention that, many of these clinical trials, based on, the reports I get from members of my community, tend to be socially and financial biased because they're not inclusive. The vulnerable populations that I know that want to take part in this, but all these factors seem to be hindrances when it comes to that. So I think that the issue of inclusion and the issue of exclusion even should be, looked into as well. So if true health equity is to be, achieved, these trials should actually make it easier for them to participate in anything, so.
And maybe decentralized trials would help in that way in some ways to enable more people to join. The next slide, please. We did also hear from some patients that reasons that they would like, what they would prefer on-site trials, and that includes some things like not having to worry about things, or they want to get out of their house, or the necessary equipment is available for them on site. I know you and I, Grace, were talking about kind of personal preferences. If
Yeah.
you were invited to participate in a trial, what would you prefer, an on-site or a decentralized trial?
Honestly, you've asked me that many times. I would actually say I'd love to be on site. Let's not forget the power of the human connection. I would opt for that because it would give me the opportunity to ask questions, to get feedback, to actually know that I'm in, a controlled environment, and see things happen in real time. So it's that would be my preference, actually. Yes. Thank you.
Interesting. Yeah, sure. Terrific. Well, thank you so much for your input, and to everybody who joined us today. We're almost at time. I know we had a couple questions before. I don't know if we have time to answer them, but before we go, I just want to make sure, join us for the next session, which will be on December 7th with my colleague Wes, to discuss a few more of these topics. And if we can't get your questions now, we'll be happy to answer them and send them out to all of the participants later on.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Grace.
Bye. Thank you.